Now it's time for another Board Game Brawl preview with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com. Hey now, my name is Nick, this is Board Game Brawl, and today we're going to be taking a look at a game that is currently seeking funding on Kickstarter. That game is called Crimson Creek, and it's from Toy Story and Enterprises. Now, if you like what you see throughout the rest of this preview video, I'm going to encourage you to go to the official Kickstarter project page. You can click on the little card up in the top corner of your screen, or there's going to be a link down in the description section of the video. Those will take you to the Kickstarter page, find out more information, and hopefully you'll consider backing the project. Crimson Creek is a semi-cooperative game. Players take control of these characters that are your typical kind of clueless teenagers who decide to spend their graduation at, of course, a haunted cabin by a haunted lake out in the middle of nowhere at this town called Crimson Creek, which many years prior was besieged by this evil Nazi war criminal who went insane and just killed a bunch of people. Now, supposedly he was hanged, I think is the proper way that you say that, and killed many years ago after his first killing spree, but now he's back. He has possessed someone at this town and has started killing everyone willy-nilly, and that includes you and your friends. However, it is possible, just possible, that he has possessed one of you. So, let me go ahead and give you a brief overview of how this game works. It's just easier to show you than to tell you. And remember, this is a prototype version of the game, so what you see in the final version may be different than what you see here. Then we're going to come back. I'll give you my final thoughts. Alright, I'm going to give you a brief look at Crimson Creek. This is a semi-cooperative game for 2 to 6 players. The goal of the game is actually going to change depending on who you turn out to be in the game. Most of the people are going to turn out to be the good guys, the people who are trying to survive the murderous rampage of the Hatchet Man. In which case, all you need to do is survive 3 acts of the game and then correctly deduce who the killer actually is, because the Hatchet Man has possessed one of your group. Now, if it turns out that you are the person who is possessed, you need to have Klein win the game. Now, what that means is that either you survive to the end and everyone else is dead, they have not been able to guess who you are, or even if you are dead, you can still win posthumously if all of the other characters die and Klein wins. You just, apparently Klein faked his death earlier as your character. Alright, so what I have set up here is a 6-player version of the game. There's several different things to note. First and foremost, you have location cards out here in the center of the table, which you will set up at random. And you see that there are the character tokens for all the different characters that are in the game. You have like the preppy and the jock and the goth and the punk and so on and so forth. They'll all start off in their normal non-panicked state, but if they're ever chased or if if you hide, you're going to have to begin your next scene, your next turn, scared, in which case you'll flip over to your scared side. And note all the different locations like the cabin and the lake, and notice that some of these locations actually have icons on them as well. I'll get back to exactly what those mean in a minute, but you're also going to see those icons up here at these other cards, which on the flip side of these cards are actually the exact same locations that I just showed you. For instance, there's the highway and there is the woods, but you're going to actually distribute these randomly at the start of the game. Actually, the players will randomly use these to determine where they start off at. Then they're going to be reshuffled and placed out here randomly, along with the last card, the 7th card, which is going to be put face down on this special lair card off to the side. I'll explain what all of that means in a moment. Down here you have different hiding tokens. During the course of the game, you'll be able to grab these tokens when you're at the applicable locations, and you'll be able to hide there in order to avoid the attacks of the Hatchet Man. Down here you have the exposure track, which is double-sided, depending on the number of players. This is for 4 to 6 players. Every time that you run, which means going from location to location, or peek, which means, well, I'll explain that more in a minute, you have to move the cube up on the exposure track, which means that it gets more and more dangerous and more likely that when it hits one of the red spots, that Klein is going to attack. There you have a cheat sheet card, and then over here you have clue cards. Now you're going to randomly shuffle up the clue cards and then put 2 of them face down with no one looking at them at the start of the game. These are secret clues to who has been possessed by Klein. So for instance, glasses and a piercing. With that information, you're going to, at the end of the game, if you can actually glean that information, you're going to try to figure out who has actually been possessed by Klein. We'll explain more about that later. Other cards are in the game. You have the attack cards. These are going to be shuffled up at the beginning, and whenever an attack happens, you're going to draw one at random. These are either going to be Calm Knight cards, or they're going to be the actual Hatchet attack cards. And after every attack, you're actually going to add another Hatchet card into the deck, and then shuffle up. So things are going to get more and more dangerous as time goes on. The Surge cards are what you're going to use whenever you're trying to find those clues. This deck is actually made up of a bunch of blank cards and 1 bloody handprint card. If you're able to draw a bloody handprint card when you are eligible to draw one of the Surge cards, when you take the Surge action, then you're actually going to be able to look at one of those 2 clues. And finally, you have the Reveal cards. Every time that Klein attacks, he reveals one of the locations on his trail up at the top of the board. So when you draw, and at that point you draw one of these reveal cards to randomly determine which of those locations is revealed to all the players. And finally, these bits are used at the end of the game. This is the Suspect card, which you're going to use to secretly lock in who you suspect Klein is. This one also lets you know which clues point to which suspect. So the cheerleader, if it was earrings and muddy shoes, that would point towards the cheerleader. Lastly, you have the Ranger token. The Ranger token is optional. Essentially, he's a supporting character. If you play with less than the maximum amount of players, then all of the character tokens are going to be used, and potentially the Ranger as well. Supporting characters can only impede you during the course of the game, although you can actually use them to your advantage in some instances. The Ranger works a little bit differently in that he can hide with you as well. Oh, there's also a word cloud token. Now, this is going to be used because during the course of the game, you cannot actively share information with players unless you are in the same location with each other, and then you can privately communicate with each other by pointing at the card to tell either clues or locations. You quietly point at what you want to on the word cloud in order to pass along information to the other player or players. Oh, I'm sorry, actually it would only be singular player because there can only be 2 people in a location. We'll get to all that. Now, the best way to describe the game is simply to take you through how turns are going to work. At the beginning of an act, when it is, you'll determine who's going to go first, and that player is going to get to take 2 actions. The first type of action is running. If you run, you are moving to an adjacent location, as according to how the cards are laid out here. Now, a location can only have 2 characters in it, whether they're supporting characters or main characters. It doesn't matter. It can only hold 2 people. So if the cheerleader wants to move to the highway from the woods, that's fine. Also note that every time you run, you move up the exposure track, but that's fine. It's because there's only 2 people here. Now, if the preppy wanted to move from the cabin to the highway, she can do that. However, she has to force a swap with one of the other characters. In other words, the preppy can move here and force the geek to go back to the cabin. And if the geek's turn comes around, he cannot immediately swap back with that character. You can't just immediately do a take back. The next type of action you can take is peeking, which would also move up the exposure track. This is using the icons on the location cards to your advantage in order to look at the corresponding Klein card at the top of the board. So if the punk is at the cemetery, he can look at he can peek secretly at whatever card has the binoculars on it. So he can look at this card here and look, it is the lake. Now you might ask, well, why would you want to do that? Well, this is a process of deduction. You are trying to figure out the lair of Klein, which is this secret card over here, by process of elimination. If you can find his lair, you can actually end the act and get one step closer to getting to the end of the game and surviving the game. But in order to do that, you need information, and hence peeking is what you want to do. Now, the thing about this is that the cabin actually has a special ability for this. If you go to the cabin, you can peek at any of the cards, of the Klein cards at the top of the board, but you can only do this once per act. And in fact, during an act, it can only be activated twice. So 2 different characters can use the cabin, and then it's done for the rest of the act. The next type of action is taking one of the hiding places. Now, you do not need to be on one of the listed on the tile locations in order to take the hiding place. But what this does is, if you know where this hiding place is by taking the tile, when an attack occurs at one of the listed locations, so for instance, if I take the Lake Woods, which is the boat, if I take the boat, and an attack occurs while I'm at the lake or the woods, I'll be protected from the Klein attack. But another one of the players can take that hiding spot from me, they just can't take it right away. It's also not completely foolproof, because if I survive an attack at a location that I'm hiding, then I have to be scared and run out to an adjacent location, and if there are no adjacent locations to run to because of things I'll explain in a moment, I'm going to be eliminated from the game. The next type of action you can take is sharing. If two players are on the same space, as the cheerleader and the preppy are here, then they can share information with one another using the word cloud that I showed you earlier to privately indicate information, either clues or locations on the card, although you are not required to be truthful when you are sharing information. Lastly, you can do a search, which is what I explained earlier, where you draw, if you're at a location, draw one of the search cards. If it is a blank card, you get nothing, but if it's the bloody handprint card, you get to peek at one of the clues. Now, the other thing to mention is that each of the characters actually has a special ability, which is something that's going to occur whenever it applies. So, for instance, the jock can spend one action to move 2 spaces instead of just one, and you can't double up on actions in a turn, so that can be very useful. So, for instance, if I have 2 actions, one of those can be to run, but the other action has to be something else. Then the preppy, for instance, has a special ability where she can actually be at an adjacent location and still share information with another character, and so on and so forth. Now, one important thing to note throughout all this is that if you look at the clues and discover that you yourself are the possessed person, then you may not want to be truthful about anything that you share during the course of the game, and you may want to manipulate the other players, because you are only going to win if Klein kills everyone, because you're Klein, essentially. You're possessed by him. So just something to note. Now, every time, I mentioned this before, but every time that Klein attacks, one of the cards at the top of the board is going to get flipped over, whatever the reveal deck tells you to do so. But after the third attack, every location card is going to be flipped over and subject to an attack. After that happens, the act is going to reset, and anyone that's actually surviving is going to go on to the next act. You'll do a reset and begin again, and then until you get to the end of 3 acts. Now, at any point during the turn before the third attack happens, and therefore you're about to go to potentially another act, unless everyone's dead, one player has the chance to go to a location that they have successfully, or they hope they have successfully deduced, is the lair. So let's say that the geek says, well, okay, I definitely think it's the barn. So they can go to the barn before the third attack occurs and declare as an action that is the hiding place, that is the lair of the hatchet man. If you're, how you're going to do that is actually privately looking at the lair card to seeing whether you were right or not. I'm just curious, was I right? I was not right, so he would have been dead. But let's say that he was. Now, if you're wrong, you're dead immediately. You just immediately and secretly kill your character, and that's that. But if you're right, the act is going to end immediately, and any surviving players go on to the next act. And also, you get, as a reward, you get to look at one of the clue cards in order to incentivize you to actually make these declarations. Now, if you make it all the way past the third act and there are still surviving players, every surviving player gets to take one of these deduction cards, which shows all the potential players in the game as well as just the surrounding townsfolk. You take one of these cards, you take your character token, and secretly make one guess as to who you think the real culprit is. Who do you think is actually possessed by Klein? Anyone who makes that guess and is correct is going to win the game. They survive. If you are incorrect with your guess, you are killed by Klein, who takes that opportunity to kill you. If there are no surviving characters left, Klein also wins. Also, if during the course of the game there's only one single survivor at any point except for the final scene, Klein will also win the game because he has all the time in the world to kill this lone last person, or he is Klein. And that is pretty much Crimson Creek. That's a quick run through of it. You are trying to survive the night or trying to kill everyone else who is surviving the night, potentially. Now, let's get to my final thoughts. The theme is key here in Crimson Creek. What the game is trying to elicit from you is the sense of panic and fear and just scrambling to get out of the way of this axe-wielding murderer, the Hatchet Man. However, you also have deduction going on. So in these regards, this game is very similar thematically to the horror movies that it was clearly inspired by, because it's the heroes trying to desperately survive, but at the same time trying to put an end to this menace once and for all. Now, throwing into the mix the fact that one of you, the players, may be the evil one, him or herself, is a very interesting aspect to it. And that's what the thing that makes it the semi-cooperative, like, who do I trust? Why did you swap places with me here? Why are you going over there? Why aren't you telling me what you saw underneath one of those cards? And so on and so forth. There's a lot of suspicion and mistrust, which again is very thematic to the source material that this game is going for. A lot of this is helped by the evocative artwork in the game. It's very stark, it's blacks and reds, it has a very visceral feel to it, together with the tokens that flip over to the scared side, just to add that little extra bit of oomph to it. So as far as theme goes and presentation, it's really, dripping all over the place, no pun intended. And as far as the gameplay as well, it's very interesting because it is a simple game. I mean, you can have this game up and running in less than 10 minutes. Everyone knows what they're doing. Everyone knows what their goal is. Everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing during the course of the game. But there's still depth there. You have a lot of different actions that you can take, deciding when to take them at the right time, deciding when to force someone into a new space or go out on your own and try to peek at one of those cards or make that ultimate declaration in order to end the act and hopefully save yourself for that act. These are all important decisions you have to make. So while the gameplay is simple, it has a surprising amount of depth to it, while all of this suspicion and distrust and going back and forth and trying to figure out what's going on. While all of that is happening, you have this surprisingly deep gameplay going on, all leading up to that final scene where the final scene where you have to guess who the killer finally is based on everything that you know up until that point, and where Klein, the killer, the Hatchet Man, still has a chance to win if he or she is one of the players. So a lot of interesting things going on in Crimson Creek. I think it's going to appeal to anyone who likes cooperative games, semi-cooperative games, horror movies, people who like hidden roles and deduction. There's a little bit of every one of those things in this game, and a lot of horror movie in it, so you definitely want to check this one out if any of those strike a chord with you. I'm going to have a card up in the top corner of the screen that you can click on, and also down in the description section of the video will be a link. That's going to take you to the official Kickstarter project page. You can find out more information than I could possibly tell you here. There's links to the rule book, there's links to a print and play that's available for a limited time. In fact, there is also information on an iOS app that you can download and use as a companion app to the game that gives you a soundtrack. It helps you keep track of different things, makes the game a little bit easier. I couldn't use it because I don't have an iOS device, so I couldn't show it to you on camera, but it is there for you to use for the game if you so desire, together with that print and play. So don't take my word for it. Find out for yourself and consider backing Crimson Creek from Toy Story and Enterprises. Thank you so much for watching. Take care. Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com. Thanks for your support.